Okay, everybody. This video is going to be a video covering not everything in the article Famine, Affluence, and Morality by Peter Singer, but what I take to be some of the key points. I have some of those key points isolated here in a page, basically notes. There's a lot in this article that I'm not going to discuss, like I said, just covering the key points. I do, however, want to give you a little bit of the context. This was written in the 1970s. Around 1977, I believe. And that matters because there are a few things that have happened since then that do affect some of the claims Singer makes in this article. So, for example, later in the article, he suggests that maybe economic growth is something economists are considering maybe is not a good thing all the time. Well, that didn't pan out. He accepts as significant an objection to his view based on worries of overpopulation. Overpopulation or worries about overpopulation were sort of all the rage in the 1960s and 1970s. By what was probably not a coincidence, issues of overpopulation tended to be brought up mostly when it came to helping those in need, the poor people, right? Somehow people in Europe and the United States kept coming back to the idea that maybe the real problem is there are too many non-Westerners in the world. But since the 1970s, really the evidence for what I'm about to tell you was apparent even in the 1970s. But since the 1970s, it's become very clear how to deal with the overpopulation problem, to the point now where there isn't a world overpopulation problem. Most countries don't face an overpopulation problem at all. Lots of rich countries face an underpopulation problem, in fact, where there's not enough people, not enough new people being produced. The natural rate of growth is too low. And we know the key to reducing growth rates, population growth rates, to acceptable levels, some people think even sort of too low levels. And the solution is basically to provide women with an education. If you provide women with an education, you provide them with you provide them with the means to gain effective economic independence of their husbands, which means that, after kid 4 or 5, women can say, as most women are going to want to after that many children, no more. We're not having 10. Even in relatively poor countries, the evidence has shown if you provide women with an education, population growth rates get under control. On a related note, because if you think of countries that have engaged in significant efforts to control their population growth, you probably think of China and their one-child policy, a policy that was sort of a waste and also was incredibly brutal. They could have just, sent their girls to school. Instead, they forced women to get abortions who didn't want them. But while the one-child policy is a very bad mark on the history of China in recent times, go along with a bunch of other things, there is one thing that that China has done, was already starting to do in the 1970s, but hadn't really gotten going yet and hadn't made a success of it yet. And that's that China has, in the 1980s, 90s, and in the last 20 years, engaged in the most significant anti-poverty efforts probably in world history. More people have been pulled out of poverty by the actions of the Chinese government than probably any other institution over a similar time period in history. So a lot of what Singer is worried about we know how to deal with at the institutional level. I don't think that undercuts the real force of his argument, though. It means that some of the empirical issues that he talks about at the end are not quite as he thought they were. But the context of when this was written, the fact that it was written over 40 years ago, does mean that there are some assumptions he makes. It does mean that there are some worries he expresses that are either false or not nearly as significant as he thought they were. But let's move on to the article. So I have here the core of his argument. So the way this paper is arranged is that the majority of the argument is announced within the first 4 or 5 pages. In fact, almost all of it's just on the 4th page, page 231. And from that point on, it's mostly about responding to objections. So prior to the 4th page, it's mostly about setting up the problem, telling you some relevant details, right? How many people are dying in Bangladesh from the refugee crisis there caused by flooding, I believe, and how much money rich Western countries are spending on things like the Sydney Opera House or the Concorde. And if you don't know what the Concorde is, it was a supersonic jet that used to fly people across the Atlantic in like 3 hours. And if you've never flown across the Atlantic, it's usually an 8-hour flight on a regular plane. Well, the Concorde could get you there in 3 hours. It was never an economical way to travel. It was so expensive to operate the plane that very few people could afford the tickets. It was a luxury. It was the ultimate luxury thing, though, to ride the Concorde. The first few pages are set up with those kind of details. The 4th and 5th page is where really the bulk of the argument gets stated, and after that, it's expressing objections. So, or dealing with objections that he anticipates. The first premise of his argument is what I have here as the first quoted sentence. I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And before we talk about that assumption in particular, I'll just say, if you don't know what a premise is, or if you're unfamiliar with what a premise is, since I'm using this as the beginning of term, a premise is just a claim you make in an argument. And usually it's a claim that you're not backing up. Right? Every argument makes assumptions. You might have encountered people who take it to be some kind of good point when they identify that you've made an assumption, right? Like you offer an argument for something and they identify an assumption that you've made and they act like they've got you. Well, they don't. Everyone makes assumptions every time they make an argument. If you didn't, your argument would go on for like, literally ever. Every argument has assumptions. Every argument has things that you're asking the person you're addressing the argument to take for granted so that you can get on with it. Right? And a premise is technically just some piece of evidence or some proposition that you offer in favor of the conclusion of the argument. Oftentimes it's an assumption, meaning you haven't provided a defense of it. When it comes to assumptions, I think it's hard to do better than this one, that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Singer says he knows there are people who dispute this, but he doesn't know how to argue against them. The way I would argue against those people is to just tell them to shut up. I mean, that's not really an argument, but anyone who says suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, or medical care isn't a bad thing is not a person worth taking seriously. You don't need to listen to them. So we can just move on with that assumption. Next point. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought, morally, to do it. And I have under there, so I'll highlight this, I have under there a claim that Singer makes about it in an attempt to show that the principle is not that extreme. He says that it does not require that we promote the good, only that we prevent the bad. And the reason why he's saying this, the reason why he's going out of his way to point out that his principle does not require you to promote the good, it only requires you to prevent the bad, is that Singer was well known in philosophy as a utilitarian. Utilitarianism comes up later in the article. Utilitarianism is an ethical view that we'll get to at the end of the semester that does require you to actively promote the good. And what Singer's basically saying here is, well, I'm not being as extreme as I normally am when I argue from utilitarianism. And he's right. This principle does not go as far as utilitarianism typically goes. Utilitarianism, which we'll look into in more depth at the end of the course, like I said, is the view that the right thing to do in any situation is the thing that has the best consequences. That requires you to actively promote the good in every decision that you make. It requires you to make the world as good as you can possibly make it with every decision that you make. This principle, the one in this article, the one I have highlighted, does not require that. It only requires you to prevent the bad. But I want to point something out about that, about that distinction between promoting the good and preventing the bad. To do that, I'll need to make use of a whiteboard program. So how do we draw the distinction between promoting what's good and preventing what's bad? You might think this is kind of straightforward, but there can be tricky cases. I mean, obviously there are some cases that do seem quite straightforward. If I am pulling a baby from a burning building, I'm preventing something bad from happening. I'm preventing the baby from dying in a fire. If I give that baby a trust fund to go to college, I'm promoting something good, promoting their education. Right? However, think of a case like this. Someone comes up with a cure for cancer. Well, you might think, well, that's preventing something that's bad. It's preventing people from dying of cancer. But it can also be seen as promoting something that's good. It can be seen as promoting longer lives for people. And of course, we all want our lives to be at least a little bit longer. Right? If I told you you have to choose between living for another year or living for another 50, you probably all would say, well, another 50. Right? So is finding a cure for cancer promoting the good or preventing the bad? And even in those cases I talked about, right, there's a way of thinking about a child who goes uneducated, who doesn't get a college education, as a bad thing, an unfortunate thing, a thing you'd rather not have happen. Right? It's worse than what you'd like. Similarly, you can think of saving the child from the fire as promoting a good thing, promoting that child's long life and all the good things that child will grow up to do. What this reveals is that if you're talking about the difference between promoting what's good and preventing what's bad, and you're saying, well, I'm only talking about preventing what's bad rather than promoting what's good, you have to have a baseline. Right? So let's say we could have a scale, right? We could have a scale that on which we could rank everything in terms of how good it is. Right? When you prevent bad things, that's good. Right? When you don't promote good things, that's bad. Right? And to see that, imagine that I have $1,000 that if I don't give it away, it's going to vanish. Right? It's in some special account. Some rich guy came to me and said, I'm going to give you an account with $1,000 in it, but you have to give it away to someone. You can't keep it. If you do keep it, that money is just going to be eliminated. It's going to be deleted. Right? The bank will write it off and get rid of it. Well, if I then don't help someone, if I don't promote some good that way, well, then I've done something bad. I've wasted money. Right? I've wasted an opportunity to help someone when there was no cost, literally no cost to me. So it seems like every time you do something good, you're preventing something bad. What you're preventing is that good thing from not happening. Every time you prevent something bad, you're doing something good because you're making sure that the bad thing doesn't happen. Right? You're promoting the absence of that bad thing. You're promoting people living their lives without those bad things in them. Seems like it's just a matter of how you describe it. And so we can, if we wanted, rank every action on a scale, right? Let's say we have a maximum goodness and a minimum goodness. But you could do it the other way too, right? This is measuring goodness, but you could also rank them on a scale measuring badness. Badness is a terrible word. I'm not even sure it is a word. We have the word goodness. I'm not sure we have the word badness. If you're looking at the badness scale or the evil scale, you want to be closer to the minimum. If you're looking at the goodness scale, you want to be closer to the maximum. But it seems like these are just different ways of describing things because it seems like the same object will be basically the same place on both these scales, right? Curing cancer is going to be up here in terms of promoting goodness, and it's going to be up here in terms of preventing or promoting of being bad, right? It's going to be really close to the minimum. So if we're going to make a distinction between promoting what's good and preventing what's bad, it seems like we need to draw a line somewhere. We need to say, okay, here's the deal. Everything, every good that we do that is here or below, where the action is here or below, right? In this region that I'm coloring in blue, that is just preventing what's bad, If you have things like saving the baby from the fire, right? Here we go. If you do that, you are doing something good. But you might say, well, because of the level of significance, it counts as just preventing something that's bad, right? There has to be some way to draw the line. And typically, the way that people draw the line is not in terms of so much amount of goodness, but in terms of what's normal, right? It's normal for children to not die in fires when they're little. It's normal for people to live a life of 60, 70, maybe 80 years. And so the way I've drawn it makes it seem like, and in fact, the way I've talked about it makes it seem like, well, it's about the amount of goodness. But usually the way that people draw the line is they have a picture of what normal life is like. And then they say, anything that preserves that normal life, anything you do that allows the normal situation to continue, that's preventing a bad. But if you're going to make things better than the normal situation, well, that's promoting the good. And the reason I bring all this up, the reason I bring up this issue about distinguishing promoting the good from preventing the bad, is that it's not clear that Singer can appeal to this distinction. Because, of course, if you draw the line in terms of what's normal, well, unfortunately, it's very normal for poor people to die. It's happening all over the place. While I record this video, several people are going to starve to death on planet Earth. Several people are going to die of easy to cure diseases. Several people are going to die of diseases for which we already have vaccines. So not even talking about things like COVID, not even talking about the coronavirus, but things that in the developed world we don't even worry about anymore. Diseases like measles. I mean, some places have to worry about measles if there's enough hippies who don't want to get vaccinated. But for the most part, we don't have to worry about measles anymore. But measles kills a lot of people, right? All over the world, not because there's not a vaccine, but because they don't have access to it. What Singer is definitely telling us to do is to give of ourselves and give of our wealth in such a way that we make things much better than they would normally be. So if you draw the line, if you draw the baseline that you use to distinguish promoting the good from preventing the bad, in terms of normalcy, well, then he's definitely telling you to promote the good. If that's not where he's drawing the line, well, then he has to tell us where that is. Now, why is this important? Well, this is just as important as it is for him to distinguish himself from the utilitarians. And that's something he definitely wants to do. And you won't understand that fully until we get to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is treated by most people as the theoretically best moral theory, right? Like if the gold standard for theorizing, and this is what ethicists do, they come up with moral or ethical theories. If the gold standard for theorizing is something like the sciences, right? Like Einstein's theory of general relativity or Darwin's theory of common descent by natural selection, right? Evolution and natural selection. If those are the gold standards, well, utilitarianism is, of all the theories, the closest there, right? Everything in it's explained, everything in it's relatively straightforward. It makes moral questions, in a sense, much easier to answer than we might ordinarily think they are. It essentially turns most moral questions into a matter of social science and math. Unfortunately, the things utilitarianism seems to tell us to do make people think that for all its theoretical virtues, it's a terrible moral theory. Now, Singer believes in utilitarianism, but he knows that if he makes the argument the following way, if he says utilitarianism is true, so you should give money to these poor people in other countries, that no one's going to go along with it because they're going to say, well, I don't know why you think utilitarianism is true. He's trying to distinguish what he's up to in this article from that kind of argument, in part by making this point, by making the point that it does not require that we promote the good, only that we prevent the bad. And one of the things that you should be aware of, or one of the things you should do when you're doing all the readings in this course, is you should not take these seemingly obvious sounding distinctions for granted. You should think about, well, what does that really mean? How do we draw the line between promoting the good and preventing the bad, for example? A lot of authors are going to think that they can get away with these kinds of distinctions. I don't think Singer's being dishonest here at all. I think he just didn't appreciate that this distinction is difficult to draw. But a lot of work is being done by little comments like this. Right? This goes by very quickly. This is just one sentence on page 231 where he says, oh, it's not that extreme. It only tells you to prevent the bad, not promote the good. But when you're doing readings, when you're looking at these texts, it's really important to focus on the things that the author maybe isn't focusing on. Right? Because if the author's making a mistake, it's probably somewhere, not always, but it's probably somewhere where they thought, well, nothing big's going on. If it's a mistake, it's something they didn't realize was important, or it's a point they didn't appreciate. So be on the lookout for that. Okay, so he's got that principle. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. He's got an alternative, weaker principle, which he announces right afterward. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. Now, those two principles might look like they're just the same. Might look like there's no difference there. But there is a very big difference there. And to see the difference, I'm going to sort of skip forward a little bit to a later point in the article, where Singer points out that this principle here, his first principle, what he sometimes calls his strong principle, the one he thinks is correct, it implies that if you live in a situation where there's a lot of help that's needed, like the situation of the 5 million refugees in Bangladesh, and not enough other people are helping, then that principle says that you have to give away everything you have until you're just barely better off than the refugees you're trying to help. So if you're a middle-class American, middle-class Americans usually have a car. Middle-class Americans usually have a house. Although we're in kind of a housing crisis in America right now, so not as many people have houses as used to. But middle-class Americans tend to have quite a bit of wealth. It's wealth tied up in things. It's not like you're rolling in dough. But you could sell your car. You could sell your house. You could sell your house and get something much less expensive. You could sell your car and stop driving places. You could stop buying any new music or clothes, right, or other luxuries and sell the existing ones you have. Take all that money, send it to go help refugees. And if no one else is helping, then all of that money is going to be needed. So according to this principle, you have to give it away because after all of your money is going to save people's lives. And you're not killing yourself to do this. You're just making your life not very fun. You're lowering yourself till you're in poverty too. That's the first principle. The second one, though, says you don't have to do that. After all, it's morally significant to give up everything you own. Right? The second principle just says you only have to give up luxuries. And in America today, having a car is not a luxury, right? Unless you want to live a very, very destitute life, you practically speaking need a car. A lot of people need a car even to get to the grocery store. A lot of people need a car to get to work. A lot of people need a car to get to the hospital. So the first principle, the strong principle, demands a lot more of you than the weaker principle. Now, he explains the weaker principle in terms of this example I've highlighted here. An application of this principle would be as follows. If I am walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. Here's how this works. He's got this case. You see a drowning baby in the water, right? No one is helping, right? So you got to go help. And if you do, it's going to cost you things. It's going to ruin your shoes, maybe your clothes. But those things are insignificant. And so we all agree in that case, unless you're like a sociopath, that you ought to go save the baby. Here's what Singer's saying. He's saying the judgment we form about this case, the drowning baby case, is best explained by this principle. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. What Singer's trying to say is this less demanding principle. Remember, he thinks the more demanding one is the correct one. But he says this less demanding principle is something everyone should agree to, because everyone should agree to this, to the right answer to the drowning baby case. Now, I'm going to assume that you all do agree that you ought to save the drowning baby if the cost is just your shoes or your clothes. But here's another example of something I want you to look out for. Singer says this drowning baby case is best explained by this principle, or rather, the correct answer to the drowning baby case, that you ought to save the baby, is best explained by this principle. And it's true that, in fact, both his principles, the strong and the moderate one, the demanding one and the less demanding one, both of them say you should save the baby. But it's not like they're the only principles that say that. Right? It could be that you can deny this principle if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant. We ought morally to do it. It might be that you could deny this principle and still get what we think of as the correct answer to the drowning baby case. Maybe you say that you have a duty to save children, but yet you have less duties to save adults. Right? If I see a baby in danger of dying, well, the baby's got no responsibility for putting themselves there. The baby can't help themselves. And a lot of people think those things matter, so I got to save the baby. Whereas if I see, let's say you're walking, along at night, it's a winter night, and you see a homeless guy on the street. There's a good chance the homeless guy will die, right? If you walk past, don't find shelter for him, he'll die. But you might think, well, he's an adult. Right? He can take care of himself. Doesn't mean he can find a home for himself, but he can find the shelter himself. It's not my job to take him to the shelter. He knows where the shelter is. He should go to the shelter. Right? Now, there's all sorts of potential problems there, like shelters don't have infinite space. There might not be room for this guy at the shelter. The guy might have some kind of mental illness or disability that prevents him from understanding those things. But at the very least, when it comes to adults, you might think your responsibility is less because their ability to handle their own affairs is greater. Whereas the baby can't do anything. Right? It's not the baby's fault that they're in the situation they're in. Now, I'm not saying that explanation is a good explanation. I'm not saying a principle that gives you greater duties to help children than adults is correct. But if it were correct, it would do just as good a job as explaining the drowning baby case. So it is true that Singer's principles would explain the answer that you give to the drowning baby case. But because it's not the only one, he hasn't proven that his principle is correct. If he could prove that his principle and only his principle would give the correct answer to the drowning baby case, that would be quite a thing. That would pretty much show that he's correct, I think, because hopefully none of you are thinking, well, maybe I'll let the baby drown. But he hasn't shown that, right? The fact that X explains Y doesn't mean that X is the only thing that explains Y. It doesn't even mean that X is the best thing to explain Y. Right? For example, if you wanted to explain why the economy is shut down, right? Right now, or why the economy is in a period of severe retraction. It's August 25th, 2020. You could say, well, at some point, somebody ate a raw bat. Right? That's an explanation, because there is a connection between somebody eating raw bat in China sometime like last November or October and the economy being shut down. But of course, there were a lot of steps in between. A better explanation would be somebody ate a raw bat. This interacted with their physiology in some ways to help, spread a virus. That virus was not caught early enough by the Chinese government, or they didn't deal with it quickly enough. It got out into the wider world. And then various governments either succeeded or failed at containing the virus and dealing with it properly. And that's what's led to the current economic situation we're in. Both of those things explain, but one of them explains better than the other. And it's not like once you say somebody ate a raw bat, you've just proven that's the whole explanation. It's not. There's multiple explanations of everything. So Singer's argument here, which he goes through very quickly, which seems to suggest that his moderate principle is true, is something you want to be careful of. This is not a decisive argument. But what he points out is that if you accept either of these principles, the strong or the moderate, then you are in a situation where a lot of your behavior has to change. And about that, he's basically just right. In the past, when I've taught this course face to face, I've started with a little exercise where I ask students to get together in groups and come up with the 10 things that they spend the most money on that are just luxuries that they could cut out of their life without any problem. And in a class of 20 people, what we find is that class of 20 people spends like 50, 60 grand a year or something like that on just straight luxuries, like going out to eat when you don't need to, buying clothes for the looks rather than just keeping you warm, music, movies, TV, games, buying a much more expensive phone than you need, right? All sorts of things that people spend their money on. And college students are not known for being the richest people in the world, right? And those tens of thousands of dollars that your average class spends over the course of a year, that can save hundreds and hundreds of lives. Right? And even on the moderate principle, you would be called on to get rid of all those luxuries and save hundreds and hundreds of lives. The extreme principle, the strong principle, would demand that like every rich person in the world give up all their money, which would of course be a huge, huge change. Okay, there's a lot more to this article. There's a lot more to say about it. But from this point on, once he's got these principles out, once he has this assumption that it's bad for people to die of a lack of food, shelter, or medical care, and then he says, and then pick one of these two principles. He thinks the strong one's true and correct, but he admits that some of you might think only the moderate one is true. Either way, if you've agreed with him to that point, you've gotten to a conclusion that is very demanding and requires a whole lot of change in your life. What Singer's basically saying is all of us are guilty of not saving people for trivial reasons. We're all guilty of doing something that is morally exactly like not saving the baby from drowning in the pool because we don't want to ruin our new set of shoes, right? Everybody has expensive stuff that they don't need. Like you're looking right now at a bunch of books, right? Like I have a really nice Charles Dickens 4 novels book. It's got gold embossed pages. I like books. I like going to bookstores and buying books. That book right there probably cost me at a used bookstore like $10. You can save a couple people's lives with $10. You can keep them alive for another month, right? And here's the thing. Keep a poor person alive for a month in another country, you've probably gotten them through the dark times, right? You've gotten them past the point where they're going to starve to death, where they're going to find some other way to survive. We don't have to keep people alive permanently because most people know how to keep themselves alive. What's happening in cases like the 1997 or 1977 flood in Bangladesh is something has disrupted their lives which prevented them from doing the thing they normally do, which is keep themselves alive. We can get people through those, right? We can get people through droughts. We can get people through floods. We can get people through giant forest fires that, destroy their farm and their, maybe the forest they rely on for hunting or something like that. We can do all those things. And what Singer says is we don't do them. We don't save people from these things. And our reasons, while psychologically compelling, have no moral force. Our reasons that we don't save the person in Bangladesh, but we would save the baby, is we can see the baby. We can hear the baby cry. Right? The reason why we help out our neighbor to overcome a relatively trivial loss compared to what's happening to people in poor countries is that we know our neighbor. We're friends with our neighbor. But what Singer's going to say is none of that matters morally. Right? All of that impacts whether or not we will do something. But there's a big difference between predicting what someone will do and saying what they should do. Right? Morality is not about predicting someone's behavior. Morality is about telling you how to behave. It's not saying, here's what you will find it natural to do. It's about saying, here's what you should do, whether or not you find it natural, whether or not you find it easy. Right? Morality is not about describing the world. Right? It's not about describing people's psychology. It's not about describing people's culture. It's about saying how things should be, not how things are. And really the rest of the article, after he lays out his argument on page 4, are just various versions of that. Right? Some of the objections he responds to, he points out, have a false basis, like they make assumptions that aren't true. But a lot of them just turn into versions of this same basic point. There are things that do make a difference to what we will do that are irrelevant to what we ought to do. Now, the reason I've assigned the Singer article is it has this bold conclusion that will make you think, hopefully, that will make you worried morally about how you behave and what you do. It's not to come to a final conclusion about Singer. I don't think you'll have the resources to do that till really the class is done, till you've looked at all the different possibilities, all the different ways you could think about morality and think about ethics. What makes this a good introduction is that it raises some ethical points forcefully, and it provides things to think about throughout the rest of the course. And I'm just going to highlight one of them. I'm not going to talk about it much at all here, because this video is getting long enough already. I'm going to highlight something that he says towards the end of the article. Page 235. The traditional distinction between duty and charity cannot be drawn, or at least not in the place we normally draw it. What we're going to see in the next article from Judith Jarvis Thompson is that she makes significant use of this distinction. The distinction between duty and charity, right? Or the distinction between what's your duty to do and what is supererogatory. This is a term I'll explain when we talk about Thompson. Basically, there's a distinction between what it is you have an obligation to do and what would be good to do, but you don't have an obligation to do it. The idea is there's something that goes above and beyond the call of duty. What Singer's saying is when it comes to the situation we're all in, but poor people in other countries, is that we don't have anything that's above and beyond the call of duty. Duty requires us to save these people. And this idea that there's this big difference between what you have a duty to do and what's just charity is a moral mistake, Singer thinks. What we're going to see is Thompson doesn't think that. Thompson thinks, no, there's a big difference between what you have a duty to do and what it would be good or kind or best to do. And that's a distinction that you should think about as we then go through the classical theories of ethics. All right, this video has gone on long enough, and hopefully you made it all the way through the end.